All right, well, good evening and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started in about 30 seconds. We're just going to give you all a moment to join us. Hey, well, welcome again. So happy you all could join us today. We have an amazing session for you all, focused on caring for the more than human worlds and regimes of forced migration. And we're also going to learn the importance of centering and amplifying newcomer youth voices and lived experiences in climate justice. My name is Alana Dawn. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships and Events Coordinator here at UCalgary, and excited to kick off the Climate Conversation Speaker Series today. So to start the session in a good way, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Calgary is located in the heart of southern Alberta. Both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani and Kainai First Nations, Piikani and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation Alberta District 5 and 6. So I share this land acknowledgement to honor and respect Indigenous cultural protocol and the people who've lived here in this land forever, and express my gratitude to live on this land. As a settler, I acknowledge my responsibilities as a Treaty 7 person and strive for truth and reconciliation. So I encourage us all to read the TRC 94 calls to action, as well as the University of Calgary Itapajo strategy, and reflect on how we can act these calls to action in our communities, workplace, and advocacy efforts. So in relation to today's topic, I encourage us all to reflect on the impacts of colonialism and capitalism globally on Indigenous and racialized communities. These communities are the most impacted by climate and social injustices and ongoing colonialism, and are also leaders in taking care of the land, more than human worlds, and in climate action. So I'm very grateful for all our speakers today, sharing your knowledge and experience, and to learn from you all. So a little bit about the Mobilizing Alberta Climate Conversation Speaker Series. This is its third year. The purpose is to engage in transformative conversations on climate action, also learn from and share diverse perspectives and worldviews on climate action to ensure we empower people to take equitable climate action and also connect with the climate action community. So we did have a session earlier today on Indigenous science, biodiversity, and climate action. That recording will be available both on the City of Calgary Climate Symposium website, as well as the Mobilizing Alberta website. In November, we'll have Renee Lertzman to speak to the psychology of care, learning how to lead in the Anthropocene. And on February 12th, we'll have a session on speculative futures, new ways of thinking about energy, culture, and climate change. So there's a QR code if you want to scan and register. Today's session is also in collaboration with the City of Calgary Climate Symposium. So a big thank you to the City of Calgary Climate team for collaborating. There are numerous great events happening this week, so I recommend you check those out as well. Okay, so the flow for today's session, we're going to introduce these wonderful people. We're then going to hear some keynote speaker presentations, and then there'll be a discussion and then opportunity to engage with participants and respond to your questions too. So you'll note this is a webinar today, so you won't have access to the chat, but please put your questions in the Q&A function that'll be at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so I'm really happy to introduce all these amazing people. Dr. Pelvi Banjari is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at University of Calgary and the Research Excellence Chair. She directs the Critical Gender, Intersectionality, and Migration Research Group and is the lead at the YARI Collective, which is the critical intersection research collaborative that was funded by the Refugees Citizenship Canada until March 2024. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Pratim Sengupta. He's a professor of learning sciences and STEM education at the University of Calgary, and also with the Workland School of Education. Up until October 2019, he also held the research chair of STEM education. He directs the Mind, Matter, and Media Lab and is the co-lead of the Youth and the Anti-Racism Integration Collective, known as the YARI Collective. I'm also happy to introduce Shanatu Dota. is a fifth-year doctoral candidate at the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary, specializing in learning sciences. His research interest lies in transdisciplinary scholarship in technology, design, cinema, towards exploration of social inequities, publicness, and justice. Also happy to introduce Shayanda Kandawal is a PhD student at the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. Her research interests are positioned at the intersection of environmental justice advocacy, migration, feminist envisioning of climate futures, speciesism, I love that word. Why am I mispronouncing it? Decoloniality and animal rights. I'd also like to introduce Rianne Lonyan, is a first-year doctoral student in the Department of Sociology. She is interested in research, migration, food, land justice, and decoloniality through community gardening and engagements with land. I'd also like to introduce Amegwa Sanyal, is a PhD candidate with the Workland School of Education in the Learning Sciences. Her doctoral work looks at the intersections of technology, migration, and gender through co-designing computational simulations with newcomer youth of color in Canada that center their stories of migration and friendship. So happy to have you all join us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you all take over.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with my colleagues. And we're going to get right into the talk. It is titled Caring for More Than Human Worlds in Regimes of Forced Migration. And I want to begin by offering a few orienting quotes. And I will situate the quotes briefly in a glimpse of what's about to come in the rest of the talk. And I will also set the context very briefly. All of this will be expounded upon in more detail as the other speakers go through. So the first orientation is really trying to hold the Canadian immigration and resettlement system accountable for a paternalistic and colonial gaze and hyper-institutionalization that positions refugees, especially refugees of color from the global south, as universal dependents, as Pallavi has put poignantly in a recent paper with her colleagues on feminist refugee epistemologies. The Dalit scholar Gopal Guru from India has talked about um, viewing migration of systemically and historically disadvantaged people in the global south uh, through the lens of creating a moral community as being the core project of migration. That such migrations, especially the kind of migration that we see in the case of refugees, people becoming refugees, people being forced to become refugees in the global south due to wars that are impinged upon them by colonial and imperial powers in the West. And then the project of migration should not be just to move them, rather to create a moral community during the process of migration as well as during and after the resettlement proceduralities. And then, but how do we create a moral community? And to this end, I think we can look at the wisdom of Indigenous scholars, especially First Nation scholars in Canada, like Dwayne Donald, a wonderful colleague at the University of Alberta, who talks about ethical relationality as being at the heart of developing such a moral community. And ethical relationality is both communal, which is caring for the community. And it's also more than human, which is caring for life beyond humans. And to the right of the visible right of the screen, we're going to see a set of entangled knots. And these are not some of the knots that we're going to see throughout the rest of this talk. Some of these knots are about enlivening sensory affective memories, such as smelling lemongrass in Angola as a kid, um, creating mythical elephants in Ivory Coast, and we'll see. I won't reveal why. We're going to see why in just a few minutes, and then in re-enlivening sensations of crossing Himalayan rivers in Azad Kashmir. Also a childhood memory, and how these sensations and memories and feelings from distant lands become rekindled, and such feelings need to be rekindled from the perspective of the embodied and affective layers of our experiences in the new homelands of these of newcomer youth of color, in order to create moral communities. And then but this is just but this is not just a thread that can run by itself. The creation of these memories are deeply intertwined with the forging of new solidarities between youth, the creation of friendships between different newcomer youths of color. And then the other thread that weaves across is these newcomer youth of color developing a regular and a caring relationship with the more than human elements within Calgary, within their communities, and perhaps a little outside their immediate neighborhoods. Um, and then the fourth layer is the hurt and the pain that most people of color carry through endured histories of colonization are are not just deep-seated within us, but they get rekindled as we undergo racialized experiences in our everyday interactions in Canada and more generally in the global North. And this is a very important part, especially for newcomer youth of color, for their experiences. And there needs to be a space where these muted histories of colonization need to be unsilenced, and the youth will decide the forms in which they can be unsilenced. And the big point that we want to make here is that the creation of a moral community within this group of newcomer youth of color whose stories we'll curate for you this evening, it is only possible, it was possible for us when we could, as we valued each of these threads, as well as the intertwining of these threads in our 2-year long and ongoing work with them, where we meet with them weekly and we work on various projects that we're going to talk about. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pallavi Banerjee, my colleague and partner, who's going to take us through the rest of the talk, and she will tag other people as she moves along. You're muted.
As always. Thank you, Pratim. So what I'm going to talk about is what creates these regimes of forced migration. The procedurality and the bureaucracy of the Canadian migration system adopts a paternalistic and colonial orientation to force migrants escaping wars and genocides. Migrants fleeing deeply oppressive conditions are not only subject to a rigid set of policies and laws, but also a complex fabric of cultural norms and rather impenetrable network of social relations that mostly exclude them and reduce their personhood and dignity on a continual basis. Rather than taking responsibility to care for newcomers in a decolonial way, the Canadian migration system abrogates the responsibility of integration and assimilation to newcomers themselves under the guise of multiculturalism. Simply put, the rigid procedures and institutional policies further refi an already racialized and systemic hierarchization between Canadians, that is the Canadian citizenry, and newcomers of color. So in our case, we see these regimes of migration become visible in the ways in which newcomer youth of color experience it through, for instance, where they live in the city. And this is by design. This is part of the resettlement plan. Most of the youth live at the farthest corners of the 4 quadrants, making their access to the city center difficult. It limits their access to the city centers, including public transits, pathways, both bike pathways and walkways. Many of the youth we work with had never been by the river until we went there as a collective, or any of the nature parks like Edwardby Park or the Douglas Fir, which is right by where we live, even after being in Calgary for 2 years. So that is the kind of limited access that's created by design. Newcomer youth of color also experience deep racialization and discrimination in their school systems, in the way that the curriculum is designed for them, in their interactions with school systems and the multiple actors within the school. The very fact that newcomer youth are prevented from graduating along with other students from their high school because of language acquisition skills chips away at their dignity at the very start of their lives. So further, as Dr. Sengupta mentioned, each of the youth carry their own colonial histories from their homelands, which are remuted in their school curriculums, and through the procedurality of the migration regime, all of which contribute to the loss of dignity and personhood that invisibilizes their humanity on a regular basis while they are resettling in the Canadian systems. Next slide. So as a protest to these regimes of forced migration, we built what is reflective of Gopal Guru's moral community. The Youth and Anti-Racism Integration, or the YARI Collective, which is a critical intersectional collaborative research project dedicated to centering the lived experiences of immigrant and refugee newcomer youth to reimagine pathways towards more equitable futures, is this moral community that we have tried to build. The collective includes 50 newcomer youth from 17 different countries who spoke 10 different primary languages other than English. It also included researchers from the University of Calgary, some of who you are meeting today. And these researchers are from education, computer science, environmental science, and sociology, and so on, for immigrant and refugee serving partner organizations in the city of Calgary. We met as a collective every weekend for 2.5 years, where the youth co-designed multimodal speculative representations of forced migration and resettlement through computer simulations, documentaries, stop-motion animations, spoken word performances, and growing a community garden together that both laid bare the proceduralities of the migration and the oppressive nature of the migration system, while also envisioning an anti-racist future that centered the experiences of grief, loss, pain, and hope that are all associated with their experiences of forced migration. I'm now going to turn it over to Shantanu Datta, who worked on filmmaking with the youth and who will introduce us to the ways the youth represented their affective and embodied journeys of loss and regaining dignity and solidarities.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. I am Shantanu Datta, and I would be presenting this next segment of the webinar. So, as the newcomer youth attempt to integrate in Canadian societies, the enduring indignity of racialization and loss of personhood that follows in the regimes of forced migration that Dr. Banerjee talked about constrains their participation in social institutions. And at YARI Collective, through our research, we have collaborated with the youth to center and highlight their narratives that uncover intersectional accesses of immigrant experiences. To that end, we co-created multimodal film artifacts with and along the youth to center such experiences. On your screen, you see the screen grabs from those co-created animations. And these animations, they depict the intimate sense of loss, grief, and racialized emotions of the youth, and which allows the sensory affective memories to be surfaced through storytelling via a cinematic form. So in this autobiographical narratives, the youth are speaking of the racialized othering in K through 12 education, anti-Black and anti-Asian discrimination tied to their physical appearances and stereotypes. They're often seen to be modifying their physical appearances in order to fit in. They are also speaking of suffering stresses due to leaving behind or being separated from their parents, unable to unite with them or bringing them over due to governmental policies or financial hardships. Next slide. So while the youth talk about racialized and marginal experiences of resettlement, they are also, through these animated films, highlight instances of finding and forging new solidarities. We see multiple facets of how solidarities are formed in the friendship and kinship networks that the youth form as a part of their survival in the city, and also as acts of resistances in their post resettlement journeys. As we hear closely to their stories, we hear that what circulates in those conversations are friends talking about the land and the peoples that they have to live behind. They spoke of sitting on hilltops here in Calgary of the homelands whose sense memories have slowly become vague, and the deep felt yearning to return to the cool rivers and the shades of the valleys of their erstwhile lands. It is in and through this collaborative work that they find a moral community in YARI Collective. It is in this community where sensory affective memories such as these could be surfaced and new solidarities could be forged. Next slide, please. So along with these two dimensions of the youth also demonstrated more than human care and unmuted colonial histories that they could not speak in the institutions that serve them. So in the multimodal co-designing work that they engaged in, they centered such stories. So next we will chart such stories of caring for the more than human worlds through the co-designing work of few of the youth, DK, Nezuko, Yasmin, Gloria, Dina, Quetzal, who engaged in making stop-motion animation films, computer simulations. They co-created a live-action documentary and also nurtured and cared for a community garden while centering a deep care for such marginal experiences. We will find out how the community based on love and solidarity contributed to the youth's dignities and belongingness that is often amiss in racialized immigrant lives in the new host societies. As in Gopal Guru's words, in the moral community, there are no strangers. Next, I will invite my colleagues and co-researchers who will take you through this journey. Chetna will take us through DK's filmmaking work.
Thanks, Shantanu. So I'll be providing more details on DK's journey with YARI today. So DK moved to Calgary with his family from Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast around 4 years ago. And as part of his co-design work with the YARI Collective, DK, along with his brother, took on the task of creating a short animation film on forest fires. So we can take a few minutes now to watch this film.
Hey Adiman, have you seen the weather?
It's very bad. It's not the first time this is happening.
I know, right? It is actually so hard to breathe outside today, and we still have to drive. How do you think this will all work out?
With all this car exhaust, it gets worse. And this is partly how we got here. And with the fire happening, all the animal and tree will die, and it will get even worse.
Oh, wow. I think this is something we all need to know about. Adiman, why don't you make a movie and show the world the movie about the weather?
Yeah, I could, but it will not be easy because there's a lot of things to do.
Yeah, but I also think that we'll never know what's possible if we don't try. And I think the world for sure needs to hear your voice. And I think you can also work with Farah and Chetna.
Yes, I'll try my best because it keeps getting worse and I want to do something about it. Fewer people used car back in 1980s and the forests were thankful for it. Real and imagined, insects will thrive in the summers but their population reduced over cold Canadian winter. This protected tree from insect infestation and rotting. Now, cars and the smoke from their exhaust have overtaken our environment. Winters are much warmer and insect populations are growing. Warm winter mean more insect-infested tree. When summer arrives, rotting tree and dry soil become perfect conditions for more widespread forest fire. The cycle continue and the impact become worse every year. So, is this the end? I really hope not.
Right. So, as we saw on the surface, the film tells the crucial story of an underlying cause of forest fire in Canadian ecologies, which can be traced back to rising temperatures. But in this presentation, we'll be zooming in on two moments in the film that express deep care towards the more than human worlds, both explicitly and symbolically. The first of these moments is when you see the ideation of the film take form in a conversation between DK and Pratham Gupta that happens at the beginning, and is shown on the previous slide, I think.
Chetna, just 1 second. Let me reshare.
Sure.
1 second. Yeah.
We go one slide back. Perfect, thanks. Yeah, so The first of the moments in which you can see deep care in the film is the ideation of the film that takes place in the form of a conversation that DK is having with Dr. Pratham Gupta. The co-designing of this film then itself became an act of deep care to center DK's affective experience of driving through smoke-filled skies in Calgary. DK says in the film he will try his best to make the film because it keeps getting worse and he wants to do something about it, expressing a desire to showcase his solidarity with the human and the ecological through artistic representations. Next slide, please. So now a more subtle expression of care towards the more than human world that we can also see in his work is when he was drawing insects that would end up populating the forest scenes that you saw in the film. DK ended up creating an imaginary species that was neither insect nor elephant. It was an insect elephant, or an elephant insect is what he called it. And it was created to honor his favorite animal, which were the elephants in Côte d'Ivoire. The history of the almost depleted elephant population in Côte d'Ivoire is marked by colonial resource extraction, especially in the form of culling elephants for the global ivory trade. Or, as DK told us, everyone in Ivory Coast knows the elephants are gone because of colonization. The elephant insect's presence in Canadian forests in his film then became a radical act of care that made colonized worlds beyond the human visible to a Canadian audience. It is subversive precisely because of how colonial histories of Côte d'Ivoire are embodied and then represented by the elephant insect. Next slide, please. But DK's story also points to the difference between making colonial ecological violence visible and then making it translatable. While DK places the elephant insect in his film, he simultaneously refused to take on the responsibility of educating the film's Canadian audience on the elephant's history. So as you saw, the elephant insect only cameos in the film. Its symbolic presence is not overtly explained through DK's artwork. He did take on acts of drawing attention to his symbolic representation by making stickers of the elephant insect and distributing it to the film's audience. And he also created this enlarged mural that literally zooms into its image. But when he was asked about the message that the elephant insect sends, he said that it was an invitation for his audience to do their own research. And this act of placing the responsibility of learning about colonialism is what Gopal Guru would call fixing negative or ameliorative responsibility onto the other. It is a protest that takes place by placing a moral burden not on the self, but on the other, which in DK's case is the film's audience. So while DK expresses his care towards the more than human world by creating the film, as well as the insect, he also practices moral resistance in refusing to be an educator. For us, DK's story highlights the significance of acknowledging colonial harm when creating a moral community that extends interspecies care and solidarity. DK reminds us that in a moral community, the work of decolonization should not fall onto shoulders of the subaltern. And next, Megha will tell us more about how conceptions of care and coloniality emerge in other youth's journeys.
Thank you, Chetna. I will now be talking about Nezuko and Yasmin's work with the YARI Collective. Nezuko and Yasmin are twin sisters who immigrated to Canada from Azad Kashmir in Pakistan in 2016. Their first engagement with the YARI Collective comprised of co-designing a computational simulation that recreated a childhood memory of crossing a river valley with their family. They faintly remembered the feeling of the cool water around their bare feet, being supported by tall mountains and forests, and valleys covered with flowers and dandelions. They created a fanciful simulation with flowers and dandelions floating around, purple hued water flowing, and a purple colored moon at the top in the middle of a morning sky. They created the simulation as a redesign of a canonical gamified simulation called the Lunar Lander, which you see on your screens right now, where the goal is to land a red spaceship on the surface of the moon while engaging in mechanistic and predictive reasoning for a successful landing. the colonial and masculine ideological basis of the lunar lander simulation is reflected through its sole focus on engaging in computational and scientific modeling in order to colonize a planetary body previously assumed to be uninhabited. Repurposing the same algorithm of the lander, Nezuko and Yasmin reoriented the simulation to break apart this ideological basis through centering their feeling of yearning for their homeland that they had left as young children. Next slide, please. Next, Nezuko and Yasmin took part in the co-design community garden. Nezuko and Yasmin's care for the Yari garden was expressed through sensory and affective engagements that critiqued the dominant narratives of assimilation imposed by global northern host societies. They express their own belonging with the Yari garden by calling it a paradise, where not just plants, but the local fauna also found a reprieve from the outside. Nezuko also expressed the feeling of pleasure and beauty in relating to the space and held up the more than humanness of the space by expressing that she felt the heartbeat of the soil. Next slide. Previously, yeah. Their care for the Yari garden also centered their desire and aesthetics rooted in their South Asian identities. Nezuko and Yasmin, like many in the Yari Collective team, are big fans of the Bollywood actor Shah Rukh Khan. Yasmin tweaked a famous Bollywood movie dialogue that features Shah Rukh Khan to express her care for the garden. The dialogue roughly translates as, "What would you know of the value of one leaf?" thus implying caring for the more than human as being beyond material value. They also reimagined the Yari garden as Mannat, which literally translates to a wish or a vow that is rooted in various South Asian spiritual traditions and is also the name of Shah Rukh Khan's home in Mumbai, in India. Their care for the more than human must be considered in this complex web of imaginative and magical worlds that is intertwined with their senses, aesthetics, and life worlds as young Muslim women from South Asia. I now turn it over to Rianne, who will speak a little further about the Yari Garden.
Thank you, Megha. So I will be telling Gloria, Dina, and Quetzal's stories in a moment, but first we want to show you some snippets from the documentary entitled Days in Shade and Sun. This documentary...
nice to hear how people...
Sorry. This documentary was made with footage taken throughout the first season of The Garden by both research team members and youth co-designers. The audio you will hear in the film was also collaboratively created as youth interviewed each other for other co-design projects within the garden.
Feel about it because sometimes you cannot put into words how you're feeling, or like you didn't expect it until someone says the same, and it's like, oh, actually that's true. So yeah, I like how like we have been all working on it, even if we don't talk every day or something, like we know that we're all doing this together, and it's quite nice to see it like going out a lot.
Right now the environment is like bad. Like the trees, having trees and plants, you will have a more good environment than how you have like if you go like there's like smokes like right now it's fire, so like there's a lot of trees are getting off. So as the garden, like we are growing up, and then the nature will grow more. So the dialogue that we say, like the one leaf, whatever I forgot. The value of one leaf. So I can say one leaf, like one leaf you plant it, if like that leaf grows. So if you plant it, it grows like more and more. So that one leaf or seed, it can grow to many. So.
was like quite surprised how things can grow so fast. I haven't actually done it myself. I have done it with my grandparents before, with my grandfather. So now that I can learn new things of how I can maybe do it by myself, it's like quite, like it's really good to know.
You were talking about lemongrass. What did you notice about lemongrass, Fatima?
Oh, the tea. I miss the tea. I used to drink a background, and here I couldn't find it here. So when I saw that in the garden, I was like, I need that. Because it just smells so good and so delicious. Yeah.
It smells like home. Literally. I miss the smell, not gonna lie. First time ever after 4 years. Whoa. Yeah. It's unbelievable. I love it.
Best thing I would like really planting. Cucumber was the first one. Cucumber because like it's I don't know how to explain it. I was very interested into it, you know. Like I wanted to know how it grew, and then I tried before and it didn't work. Because cucumber was the first thing I tried when I was a kid, and it never grew.
So I think it's the nature, it's healing. So that's why I think, and especially when you put all your love and care on this planet, so it will give you something back.
Like all the animals that come to our garden, I like them because they're pretty and I like watching them. It's really peaceful. I enjoy watching animals, birds, squirrels, just wander around, look for food and stuff. And yeah, with our plants, like when I notice some change, I know it's a good change because sometimes it could be bad, but mostly it's a good change that they're growing and new things are happening. Yeah, with these birds moving around, it's just so nice watching them. They're just pretty. Yeah. We also have food here for them, so they can come here and eat. They have all the freedom here that they don't get outside.
जब वो लगाना शुरू किया ऐसे लगा जैसे कोई अंदर चीज़ है मुझे खींचे है। जैसे बैक्टीरिया की बात करी थी, जैसे इतने अच्छे बैक्टीरिया कुछ होते हैं कि वो खींचते हैं अपनी तरफ, तो ऐसे फील हो रहा कि जैसे पाकिस्तान वाली मिट्टी के साथ ऐसे मैं कह रही हूँ घर हमने बनाने मिट्टी के।
Because like I love nature, trees, especially I love like to like yeah, I love all of those things. So when you are there, you feel like something heal inside you. Yeah, so I really love that.
Our entrance to our manhaj. This summer it didn't go that much, but next summer we're looking forward for it to grow. We'll sit over there in the shade, and the design looks good. Our door manhaj. Oh, our door to enter manhaj.
But it's actually nice to hear how people feel about it, because sometimes you cannot.
You want a moment for team to get the slides back? Okay. Thank you, Pratim. So I will be discussing some of the key ways an ethic of care for and with the more than human emerged and coalesced in the garden. Megha has already touched on the sensory, affective, and imaginative engagements with the more than human in the garden. I'd like to highlight how home and homeland were integral aspects of these engagements and how these speak directly to regimes of forced migration. So let's begin with Gloria. Gloria came to Canada in 2019 from Angola, where she recalls tending to a kitchen garden and a small farm plot with her family. She joined the gardening activities eager to get familiar with the soil here, as she said, and as her parents were familiar with the fertile soils of her homeland. More than becoming familiar with the soils of this land, Gloria found home in the garden and through the sensory, material, and embodied movements and activities of gardening. Reflecting on these activities like planting and weeding, she said she could not recall doing anything that felt like home since she came to Canada until she put her hands in the soil. We witness Gloria in such a moment of recognition here, where she exclaims with profound joy upon smelling lemongrass for the first time in the 4 years since she came here. The depth of feeling and infectious joy Gloria expresses here as she reconnects in an embodied way with her home is a reflection of the systemic erasures she has encountered through regimes of forced migration. You can go to the next slide, please. Even more so, connecting with the more than human and home through gardening brings the fact of these youths' forced migration back to the forefront. As we tended to the garden, many of the youth made similar powerful affective and embodied connections to home. For example, Dina, who left Pakistan when she was quite young and lived in Malaysia for several years before migrating to Canada 3 years ago. Here, she says that as she plays with the soil, she feels as though it is Pakistan's soil with which she is playing. And in that moment, she is reminded, and she reminds us, that she was forced to leave Pakistan behind. Embodying a sense of home in the garden was not integrative, in that it did not entail naturalization or assimilation. Embodying home involved simultaneous dislocation and relocation, both here and there, then and now. Within the context of these regimes of forced migration, the youth's connections to home through the collective engagement with the more than human brings the tension of their presence here in Canada to the surface. As the youth each experienced and found different connections to home in the garden, they also formed solidarities through this collective work. I think Quetzal, who is from northern Mexico and came to Canada 5 years ago, says it best. She says, I like how we have all been working on it, even if we don't talk every day or anything. Like we know that we are doing this together, and it's quite nice to see that we are not alone. Quetzal voices here that the collective work of tending to the garden bridged connections among the YARI youth and research team, reorienting patriarchal frameworks of integration and care toward a model of deep care that is collective and includes the more than human. In Gopal Guru's framework of migration as moral protest, we can see this as an example of positive responsibility and the creation of a moral community that does not mute the colonial histories and contemporary formations of regimes of forced migration, and that embodies a praxis of deep care with the more than human. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Banerjee, who I believe will be beginning the conclusion.
Thank you, Rihanna, and thank you for those really inspiring and deeply touching stories. So these stories of the youth and the representations they created in this moral community can be also seen as moral protest, what Gopal Guru calls moral protest, that emerges through solidarities with both human experiences of pain, loss, grief, and hope, and solidarities with the more than human affective landscapes like the garden and the plants and the land. It is in these moral communities where we begin to reimagine a future beyond colonial regimes as embodied desires, curiosities, and longings emerge while tending to both the sentient and the non-sentient. And it is in these moral communities that we begin to become one as a community, and where we no longer have strangers, as Guru has pointed out. I'll turn it over to Pratim to take us to the conclusion.
So thank you, everybody. This is a really moving presentation, even for me, who has lived this work with you for such a long time. This is really the final slide. It's a messy one, and I wanted it to be messy because I also wanted to make sure that the work lives in its true form of messiness. And this is really a repeat slide with some photos added, photos of the collective work of developing a moral community. And so this includes laying our hands on a plant, digging the soil, failing to tend, and then learning to tend together to plants. This includes finding new friendships with other newcomer youth of color, despite facing deep segregation in the school. This includes suddenly stumbling upon some deers and stumbling upon and chasing some gophers in their garden. This includes creating a mythical elephant so that people realize what happened to elephants in Ivory Coast, why certain more than human life forms are no longer there because of the entrenchment and reach of human greed through imperialism, racialized human greed, right? People of color really can't be confident that they can hold on to their responsibilities of taking care of land and life. And then even when they migrate to the global north, we must fit into patterns and languages that have already been decided by a couple of colonial powers through systemic erasure. And then there is the work of completely taking on what should count as STEM education, what should count as education, computing education. These are things that we are barreled upon by different mandates in our classrooms. And then really knowing that there is a space where we can actually hold these mandates accountable to the hidden and muted realities and senses that newcomer youth of color bring with them. And then, so really these threads of enlivening our senses and feelings from distant lands and water, forging new solidarities, centering the more than human care across space and time, the multispatiality and multi-temporality, and then the constant work of unmuting colonial histories that naturally comes to the surface as we become more and more comfortable in living through the sensory affective realms of experience. this is how we create a moral community. And and without this moral community, then the work of uh, uh, the educational work of moving toward climate justice, toward ecological justice, I think will be impossible sometimes. Sometimes I think it'll be impossible. Sometimes I think it'll be extremely difficult, especially if you look at it from the perspective of newcomers of color, and especially newcomer youth of color. So thank you to all of you for being so patient and going through our presentation. In particular, we are thankful to all members of the YARI Collective. You can just Google the YARI Collective and any of our names, and you will land on the number of websites, and especially our colleague and friend, Dr. Jonathan Gilligan from Vanderbilt University, who contributed tremendously toward a lot of the work that you've seen through his partnership and friendships with the youth. You can also reach Pallavi and myself by email, or any of the wonderful doctoral scholars by email. Again, all you have to do is Google our names. Thank you, everyone. I will turn it over to Alana Don.
Yeah, I just really, really want to thank you all. It's very moving presentation. The presentations, the artwork, videos, messages, the moral protests, the joy, and seeing the youth care connection for the more than human world and that bringing back memories is really beautiful. I'm reflecting on a lot that you've shared. I have a couple of questions for you all, but there was one question in the chat that I thought maybe we could start with on, it might help them in their reflections on what they've learned from your presentation on what speculative representation means.
Fatim, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, it really means, so for example, the mythical elephant in Ivory Coast is a speculative representation. I mean, for two reasons. One, the elephants are no longer there in Ivory Coast because of colonization. And two, DK's elephants, the creatures that DK created, have wings which they can use to fly away. And the reason they need to fly away is so that when the history of colonization gets reenacted, so that they will no longer be extinct. Will Ivory Coast be colonized again? Probably not. But in DK's mind, the effect of colonization is so long lasting that in his imagination, elephants elephants need to be saved from these speculative reenactments. And this is what we call the representations of possible futures that might actually never happen. But it is through the speculative representations that DK is actually putting the responsibility on the viewer to think hard about. So the work is upon us, the audience. And DK flat out refused to say anything more and said that just put a link to the histories of Ivory Coast that might be available on Wikipedia and some resources. And we actually did the hard work with him of finding those resources. And in our public installations where the youth actually shared these works with UNHCR heads as well as the city and the university communities over the course of last year and a half, we put those links out there. We created murals where people could actually go and learn about those but why this mythical elephant exists in the first place in DK's work. So that's that's a form of speculative representations. What Megha showed is also another example of a speculative representation where the lunar lander code was sort of reframed with with many original parts of the code being done and modified a little bit, so that instead of the objective of the simulation being landing the spaceship, that part of the code was used to represent how daffodils could land, and then the notion of then there were other pieces of code that were reused, and all of this is speculative representations or examples of.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to provide that deeper learning. I really appreciate it. I'm sure viewers do too. So a question I have for everyone is, and this is I realize this is a very large question, so you can answer it how you wish. But based on your learnings in working with newcomer youth, what changes do they wish to see, as well as yourselves, related to resettlement process, migration policy? I know these are massive questions. Values and system changes. Because for Team, you were saying, I think what I was hearing that in creating the moral community, there's a lot more work that can be done in order for centering youth voices in climate justice. So
I can start and then I'll, put this out to the other panelists. I think, to your question, I think actually putting them in the center of these conversations is what will bring about any changes, right? And the collective that we have has shown that when we center youth voices, we can have a vision of the future that is at its core different than what we as even immigrant researchers here, all of us, most of us are immigrant researchers here, can envision. So it is about stepping back and giving and moving aside and giving the platform and the mantle to the people whose lives we are trying to change. So I think that's one. I'll give you one short example of how, I mean, this is very speculative. So Nezuko and Yasmin, when they were creating, and Megha, you can correct me if I get the story wrong, but when they were working with Megha to redesign or reframe the lunar lander gamified simulation, one of their first ideas was because they are BTS fans, they wanted to recreate the immigration system of Canada so that anyone entering Canada just had to sort of either play or sing a BTS song for entry. And that is a vision that kind of pushes back against this procedurality and bureaucracy, the colonial bureaucracy, right? And it is speculative, but can we imagine that? I think we can. So I will throw it back to the panel for other thoughts.
I can also chime in. I think it's also, I mean, because I'm doing my PhD in education research, I think schools and like formal education spaces are also another sort of context and a location uh, where we regularly see a lot of indignity, and some of it has been mentioned in the presentation as well. So I think just valuing the dignity of a newcomer youth in formal learning spaces, and sort of reimagining how, not just in terms of like rules and what they are eligible for, or which grades they can join in, starting from very basic things like that, but to also sort of thinking about what is it that they can do in the future. Even messaging, there's a lot of like direct and indirect messaging about what they are capable of, based on what courses they are assigned and what kind of classes they have, they are segregated into. So I think these really real things are something that really need to change, and we need to center their dignity when we are thinking about these processes. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can also add that one of the things that the youth helped us center is definitions of the environment that are not as colonial as they typically are in mainstream movements, right? So the difference between thinking or conceptualizing the environment as an unpeopled land versus thinking of the environment as environmental justice scholars would, which is the place where places where we work, live, play, and pray when applicable. And these are conceptions of the environment that the youth have encouraged us towards. And you can also see that sort of in how the YARI work looks at all aspects of their lives, like various institutions that they're part of, and not just them in one location. So that's.
Thank you. Just want to make sure, did anyone else want to jump on that question or? Sorry, and there's so much here. It's so wonderful, and I'm like reflecting on all of it. But so the one question I have is, well, I think we've already spoken to this already. So I guess I'm wondering, in your experience with the youth, what has been for you the most changing or impactful?
I can take a stab. Okay. And then people can join in. I think the first order of change is that we need to learn to listen to the youth, as opposed to always lecturing them on this is a good way to be, this is how they need to act, this is how they need to be in accordance with the expectations, both institutional expectations and implicit expectations. I think the youth also bring in a lot of histories of indigeneity which get erased when they land in Canada. They're only looked at as immigrants, but many of them have ties to indigenous communities in their homelands. Those histories of indigeneity also need to be recognized alongside the indigeneity, the indigenous epistemologies in First Nations in the Turtle Islands. There are solidarities, there are differences, and there is room for all of those differences in the work that we do. And I'm seeing a question to this effect. This is also the answer to that question. And I think we need to be very, very careful before ordering them to change their language, to change their words. I think they're just as capable, and their languages are much more heterogeneous. So some of the Englishes that we hear are also different and way more enriched and poetic than the grammatically correct Englishes that we're used to hearing in mainstream societies in the US and Canada. And they need to be recognized as richer forms of language rather than as languages that need to be corrected. So I think we need to really fundamentally learn to hold ourselves as earlier settlers on this land accountable to our own ways of whipping newcomers into shape in various forms. And I think that's very, very important to center that humility before speaking at immigrants of color. Very important to take a step back. Anytime we find ourselves suggesting, like, oh, here is how you need to be fixed, stop, step back, reflect, and mostly the answer is you don't need to say that. And I think that's true as an institution, that is true as an individual, that is true as a politician, that is true as colleagues, that is, and by the way, what we have seen is a magical thing about differences. So when youth made friends, many of them, actually almost all of them, they made friends with, they made deep friendships with one or two other youths who they met in very segregated spaces in school and after school. And they typically didn't know how to speak languages of their other counterparts. This is actually a very powerful moment for us, because we realized that they learned to speak or interpret enough of the other unknown language through different apps like Google Language and whatnot, Google Translate and whatnot, and they didn't need any introduction. And the irony was they were put in a class that fundamentally takes a deficit lens, which is, English as a second language, English as an additional language, and these are very diminutive spaces for people of color to be in. And so, but look, I mean, none of that's going to change, because we are not going to ask for a change, because that change requires real political change, which we always will fall short of. And because for those things to change overnight, there needs to be a revolution, which will just not happen in hyper-polite colonial societies. And I know it sounds like a rant, but it is not. I think we have replaced humility and kindness in Canadian society with colonial politeness, and we're very good at it. We're very good at hiding things under the rug. And what these youth are showing us, that, if we let them lead, they are going to offer us new ways and ways to do this. I'm seeing a question by Wendy that is it okay if I also just quickly answer that? So Wendy, the youth are I shouldn't say self-selected, but they self-opted to be a part of this project. At no point during this project did we ever recruit anyone, in the sense that we never invited specific people. We put a call out through our partner organizations, and four of Calgary's major institutions that serve refugees and new immigrants, SPO, service providing organizations, they partnered with us. So their client bases received an email from them, and we worked with any youth of color, because that was the mandate from the government. The mandate was fundamentally to center to develop notions of what anti-racist resettlement policies and experiences might be. Okay. So that's
Anyone else wants to contribute to this question?
There are a couple other questions in the Q&A, or if you need another minute to reflect.
Thank you, Mary, for that. Yeah, we are both a celebratory community, but also a community to uphold certain invisibilized truths about newcomer youth of color and other groups who are invisibilized. So.
Yeah, do you have, sorry, I'm picking up on that. Just catching up on Q&A. Is there upcoming events you'd like to share?
Not yet.
Okay.
We are going to be hosting an annual conference or a gathering of sort where we would be talking about the work and also the, centering voices of the youth, of the present collective, but also, we have new youth joining, so there might be more such voices that we can hear from, but not right away. Maybe next year.
Well, we're at about 20 after 6, so do we want to do like a roundtable of any final messages or thoughts you'd like to share?
Shantanu, we haven't heard from you. Rian, we haven't heard from you in the Q&A, and I'm wondering if you had thoughts to share.
Thank you. Some ideas just to trail from what Megha had pointed out earlier, and also following what Dr. Sengupta and Dr. Banerjee have been talking about is also to kind of highlight that in our process of working with the youth, it has really been a collaborative design process, and I just want to highlight the deep implication of that is the fact that it has never in this rich exchange that there has been we as researchers have worked with them with an upper hand of showing how to do things, but rather taken the leadership from what the youth wanted to do and how they wanted to do. The heterogeneous and the multimodal forms of representations that we presented at the webinar today kind of speaks to those many ways in which immigrant and refugee youth want to center their voices. It also kind of carries an implication for educators and anyone who is working with newcomer youth to really allow them in many different ways in which their affective, sensory, their ethical utterances can get shape and form. And those need not be in the strictures of English speaking, knowing the correct diction, maintaining the decorum as mandated in school curriculums and stuff like that. What we need are more heterogeneous spaces, after school programs in which such uh, tendencies can be cultivated and can be encouraged and centered. What we also did in our research is to create a space which is not just exists in the communities or in the schools. Most of our work was centered in the public facing installations that we did, in which we invited folks from the city, from their educational institutes, from the refugee serving organizations to take part in. And I hope, and we all hope, that the city of Calgary does more of such events and encourages youth participations along those lines. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot else to add, but I just to reiterate this idea of centering the voices of the youth, and what that means, and how this, like, we have to curb this urge to change or try to make their voices fit something else, but to honor their voices as they are, and to value them as they are, I think is the most important part of centering the voices of the youth, because as we have seen, so much of what they're told in these other institutional spaces is that they need to change and that they need to be something different than what they are. So that would be the thing for me to highlight.
Anyone else? to round off.
Pallavi, would you like to round us off?
I can say something and you can round us off.
Okay.
So I just wanted to thank everyone, and I know the youth are not with us, but they are always with us because we are carrying their voices, and I wanted to center that. I think the stories that we have shared, the work that we have shared would not be there without their contributions. So I wanted to, while centering that, I also see this as a work of research, and every act of research and every act done through colonial institutions is an act of violence. And so I also take responsibility for that. I don't think we are infallible, and that's fine. We need to recognize where we are failing, the communities that we are working with, and rebuilding. And I think acknowledging that is really, Alana Dawn, you asked what is the most impactful part, and this is the most impactful part for me, to be humbled and to be learning from the youth and to be led by them. And what that means is to acknowledge that what we are doing is not without. It's we are not beyond the colonial institutions that we are in. So kind of encountering that as we do this work is of key sort of essence of in the work that we are doing. So I wanted to kind of center that. And I think that also brings us to this idea that what we are doing is not just about research, the artifacts that we are creating, it is taking us to this more than human space.
Yeah, and thank you, Pallavi. I think it's a really important reminder for us to recognize that. And I will end with this: that moral community is not moral community with everybody. Moral community is not moral community with people who turn a blind eye toward collective sufferings of people of color. And a moral community is not moral community with institutions that just act as if nothing is happening while we sit here. Moral community is not moral community with people who believe that adhering to colonial laws will somehow magically save the world from more horrors and stop ongoing horrors from happening. The youth actually have no moral ambiguities in events that have unfolded. None of the youth have any moral ambiguity. They know exactly what's going on. They call it out. They actually have designed many of the things that are on our bodies, and it is important to honor that too. It is important for us. It was important for us to learn from their courage. It was important for us to recognize that that sometimes our silence and inaction is simply not worth it. And that's the lack of a silence in some cases is fundamentally unethical and immoral. And we need to recognize that. We need to find that deeper voice in us, not the institutional voice that forces us to be silent and polite, because that is the voice of the colonizer. That is not our voice. Our own voice need to be centering the people who are in the margins. And this is really this fundamental moral core of being oriented away from the colonizer's gaze and toward the people in the margins. This is the greatest gift that the youth has given us. And I think without this gaze, no amount of jargonizing about this value and that value and traditional wisdom, it'll just remain as a jargon. And I think to really be able to center care for the more than human, we need to find value, and we need to value us, our own bodies, and also, more importantly, bodies of color who have been set aside and excluded from what should count as normative and hegemonic histories. And I'll just end there. The youth couldn't be here today for various constraints in their lives. They have much more complex lives than we do. But the courage you hear in my voice, hopefully that comes across, is actually their voice, the courage that we learned from them by staying with them for the last 2 years. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, totally. Thank you all. I've loved seeing all the hearts and claps that are rolling in. And thank you all for the work you're doing with the youth and for such powerful presentations and for, yeah, the youth's voice was very powerful today as well, even though unfortunately they couldn't be here. So thank you all. I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Alana Don. Huge congratulations to you for, I know, the behind the scenes work that Alana Don has put in. She graciously invited me to be on the committee that planned some of these events, and I've learned a lot from the committee that you put together. And thank you very much, Alana Don, for making this possible in the first place, and the city for its partnership. And I look forward to learning more from the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Lana. Have a good night.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.